The Cold War was essentially humanity's 50-year arms race, in which everybody was trying to get the biggest, the loudest, the most powerful, pretty much everything. And there are many stories in that are pretty well known, some of which I've touched on other videos on this channel, although I do try to touch on the less known stories. This will be a continuation of that, because while when people think of NATO vehicles, there's a very wide variety that they could picture in their head, and these could come from a variety of nations. But when people think about the Warsaw Pact, it's just Soviet equipment, maybe with different stickers on them. So today I'll be talking about the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact vehicles developed during the Cold War. To elaborate on my previous point, if you think of a Cold War NATO APC, you could picture the American M113, the British FV432, the British box, the French VAB, or the German Fuchs. Yes, not all of these came out at the same time, but you get the idea. If you think of a NATO IFV, you could come up with a American M2 Bradley, the British Warrior, the French AMX-10P, or the German Marder 1. And while there are certainly design commonalities between them, they are all different vehicles. If you think about main battle tanks during the, let's say, the mid-Cold War period, you could have the American M60, the British Chieftain, the French AMX-30, or the German Leopard 1. Again, there would be commonalities, usually in terms of sharing the gun, but again, they are all different designs. But when you think about the Warsaw Pact for their armored personnel carriers, you have the Soviet BTR 60, 70, 80, or the MTLB. For IFVs, you'd think the BMP 1 or 2, or the BMD 1 and 2 if you want to go more for the airborne versions. If you want to talk about tanks, Soviet-made T-55s, 72s, 64s, or 80s. But the Warsaw Pact wasn't just the Soviet Union, nor did the Soviet Union have all of the heavy industry. The pact would include Bulgaria, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia as well. Some of these countries, particularly Czechoslovakia and Poland, actually before the Second World War, had their own domestic tank programs. The Czech tanks would be widely used by the Germans after their factories were captured in the pre-war / very beginning of the war, depending on where you want to draw your lines. And while they weren't as good as their German equivalents, they were respectable and viable vehicles available in large numbers. So what happens? Why is everyone just think of Soviet vehicles? Well, one of the reasons for that was that the military independence of the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact nations were not as respected as that of the non-American NATO nations, especially the larger economies. And so Soviet-designed vehicles would absolutely be dominant in a way that American vehicles wouldn't be, at least once you get past the 1950s and early 1960s when, well, most of Western Europe was still rebuilding from being rubbled during the Second World War. So let's take a look at what some of these Warsaw Pact nations came up with, shall we? Starting with Bulgaria. Bulgaria would produce the BMP-23. Now, in concept and role, this would be very similar to the BMP-2. However, its design was based off of the chassis of the 2S1 Gvazdika, the 122mm self-propelled gun. Some of the effects of this different development path would be that it has 7 drive wheels as opposed to 6 on the case of the BMPs, which makes it a little easier to recognize. The 2S1 is also a larger chassis overall, so the troop compartment's a bit less cramped. The main gun used is a 23mm autocannon, which is actually the same gun as on the Zu-23 AA gun, although this is a single mount as opposed to the twin mounts, which is more common for that in an anti-aircraft setting. These would be produced starting in the early 80s. They'd make a bit less than 200 of them, and only Bulgaria would make use of these, which is certainly respectable for a smaller military, at least in terms of, Cold War European militaries, a smaller military. Moving on to Hungary, we would have the D442, or 442, however you want to say that, Fug. Now, primarily this was a reconnaissance vehicle, although it would have the D944 light armored personnel carrier, which was a little bit more of a heavily armored version that would mostly be used by the Hungarian border troops, as, well, they didn't kind of warrant a full, proper armored personnel carrier. And these would actually be produced in pretty decent numbers, starting in 1964, about 900 of them. They'd be used by, of course, Hungary, the country that made them, but also in Czechoslovakia and Poland. In both of these, it would be referred to as the OT-65. Next on the list is East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic. English is GDR, but of course, if you were looking at it in German, it would be the Deutsches Democratic Republic, so it would become DDR. Unfortunately, they didn't actually have any. There would be military industry in East Germany, of course. However, it wasn't newly built tanks or armored vehicles, built from raw parts and the like. It was minor upgrade packages, usually in regards to being able to domestically upgrade their equipment to external upgrade standards. So there would be upgrades for T-55s and T-72s, but these wouldn't be unique upgrades or really visually identifiable upgrades. It was just bringing them up to an upgrade standard that had been developed usually by the Soviet Union. Poland, however, would be a country with a considerably more extensive defense sector during the Cold War. However, it wouldn't produce any of their own stuff. The Polish would produce licensed versions of various Soviet equipment, including about 10,000 T-55s. A identification method you could use to figure out if something's a Polish built is that toolbox mounted on the turret. Seems fairly common within Soviet-built ones. There are going to be other features that are distinct, but that's the most readily visually apparent. They would also make export versions of the T-72. These would be the M and M1 versions. They'd also produce pretty significant numbers of 2S1s, the Gvazdika from earlier, as well as BMP-1s, or by their distinction, BWP-1s. And when an industry builds 10,000 tanks, that's not a small defense sector. And that is one of the reasons why in modern day, Poland has its own tank plants and tank programs. Yes, there's still developments and upgrades of the T-72, but it is a tank program, and there's not that many countries that can claim they have their own tank programs. Then we have Romania. Now, all of the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact states had interesting relationships with the Soviet Union that could vary quite a bit by when you're looking at it, so there was always at least a certain degree of tension where the local government would want to have more actual authority separate to the overall Soviet authority, and that push-pull was an ongoing conflict. The particular flavor of push-pull that would happen in Romania would have some of the more interesting effects out of the various Warsaw Pact countries in terms of their defense sector. I apologize for the image quality for these, but it's the best I could find that weren't either super zoomed in or modernized. And these would be the Tab 71 or 77s. These would be slightly modified licensed production of Soviet vehicles. The Tab 77 was a BTR 70. They started producing that in 82. And the 71 would be a BTR 60 PB, which they'd start producing in 1970. And they'd make a good number of these. Again, 2,000 of these. They're cheaper vehicles, yes, than tanks, but any defense industry that's producing vehicles and hits 4 digits is one you can't discount. They wouldn't be particularly widely exported, but there would be some exports for them. In a similar vein, also unfortunately with poor image quality, is the MLI 84, which is a modification to the BMP-1 design, specifically using their own domestic engine, which was a little bit more powerful, but it was also heavier. This meant that the amphibious capabilities of the BMP-1 were more challenging. A stock BMP-1 does not have a particularly high freeboard in the water, and these versions had a downright dangerous freeboard. They'd start their production in 85, and a little less than 200 of them were made, which, again, as far as for just internal use, isn't bad. A somewhat more unique design is the MLVM. Now, this is, again, it's slightly armed, lightly armored, and this is effectively an armored personnel carrier designed specifically for mountain warfare. It had entered service only in the very late 80s, and less than 100 of these would be made, but it's a specialist vehicle for specialist terrain. So those kind of small production numbers aren't as bad. Now, though, for the really interesting part. The Romanian tank program. Because of how exactly that Soviet Warsaw Pact member state tug of war as far as authority was going manifested itself, meant Romania had the ability to make tanks, but never actually got the production license for the T-55, which had become their mainline tank after they began retiring their T-34s. So despite the fact that the TR-77 580 looks an awful lot like a T-55, it isn't, nor is it an upgrade package. It is its own indigenous tank, although the influence are, well, very apparent. If you want to tell them apart, look at the road wheels. Road wheels is actually a pretty good way of telling vehicles apart usually. This has 6 road wheels as opposed to the T-55's 5. It was also originally meant to have the same engine as a Leopard 1, but the East German government decided they didn't want to export tank engines to a Warsaw Pact country, which you can kind of understand why. It would also have a Romanian-made 100mm main gun. And you can visually tell this apart from the gun on T-55s, but it's not as easy an identifier as, counting road wheels. Production of this vehicle would start in 76, and about 400 of them would be made, with roughly a third exported. So a moderate export success, that. Now, Romanian tanks have gotten a bit of a bad rap in the tank enthusiast crowd on YouTube, so I feel the need to defend them a little bit here. When the TR-77 580 entered service, it wasn't a bad tank. In fact, in 1976, a lot of Soviet frontline formations still had T-55s, of which this is a pretty good contemporary for. And outside of the actual Soviet military, pretty much everyone in the Warsaw Pact was still using T-55s. So it was entirely within the power curve at the time. Yes, there would be better Western designs available at the time, but those countries would also have a significant number of their older tanks still in service. The situation changes a little bit for the TR-85. Now, this is a general improvement upon its predecessor. Production would start in 86, and they'd make about 600 of these, about a quarter of which would be exported. These would be the bulk of the Romanian tank fleet when they began to have their NATO application process. And of course, one of the things that's involved in that is upgrading your military to NATO standard, which is not... it can be a useful term, but it's not used well in a lot of places. So it's kind of a nebulous term. So we're kind of going to... I cover it for purposes of completion, and that this is the tank Romania modernized, but as I said, The production of this is a lot less in line with the power curve than its predecessor, because if you're producing from new what is effectively an upgraded T-55 when the Soviets have completely changed over in their frontline formations into T-80s and T-64s, and their second line formations are near enough all switched over to T-72s, you're not meeting the Soviet power curve. Most of the other Warsaw Pact nations were now pretty heavily using the T-72, although they would still have pretty significant numbers of T-55s. So you're a bit behind the power curve there. The Western nations, you now have Abrams, Leopard 2s, upgraded AMX 30s, as well as the first of the Challenger 1s. You're pretty far behind the Western power curve as well. It's maintaining a domestic tank sector, but yeah, that I kind of have to agree in terms of modern tanks. It's pretty anemic. Moving on to something that can produce things at a bit larger scale. Czechoslovakia. Another country like Poland with a substantial heavy industrial sector. And like Poland, would have a very large production of license-built equipment, about 11,000 T-55s, their own T-72s, again, M and M1 export versions, and they would of course make their own BMP-1s, under their designation ABVP-1, and they'd make about 18,000 of these. However, they also made this, the OT-64 Scot, or SKOT. Not sure if it's supposed to be pronounced or spelled. This would be a joint Czechoslovak and Polish vehicle. It would be known as the OT-64 in Czechoslovak service and the Scot-1 in Polish service, although there would of course be many naming variations depending on upgrade package and specialization, reconnaissance, command, radio vehicles, that kind of stuff. Production would start in 1963, and they would make 4,500 of these, which makes them one of the most successful and widely used, because these were also exported fairly significantly, of the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact nations. And honestly, looking at that picture on the bottom, yeah, I think this thing doesn't get nearly as much attention as it probably should. It's a pretty neat-looking vehicle. Certainly shows its influence, but it's also got its distinctive elements to it. And because they were so widely produced, there's quite a few of them still around, and with some fairly significant upgrade packages. Something that's a little more problematic is the OT-90, which is a BMP with an OT-64 turret. I include this for completion because English language sources that I was able to find is pretty poor, so I don't know how many of these were made. I don't know when they were really made. I mean, the naming convention tells me it might have been produced at the very end of the Cold War, or it could be immediately post the Cold War. But I also thought I'd include it as an example of how you will often see Soviet equipment is upgraded or modernized, both during the Cold War and after it. Very frequently you will see things where, like on these BMPs, the turret is swapped over for something else. This is actually also something that the Russian Federation does with a lot of its older Soviet equipment, is they swap the turret over, for example, taking the BTR-80 and making it into a BTR-80A by giving it an autocannon, and new production versions that are a little more homogenized in terms of its design, but have the same equipment, is then the BTR-82. But that will wrap up the Warsaw Pact vehicles for this video. But I do have a bonus country. It wasn't part of the Warsaw Pact, but a lot of its vehicles are very, very heavily based off of Soviet designs. So I thought if I was going to talk about them, this would probably be a good place to do it. And of course, that means talking about Yugoslavia. A country with a history that is very complicated, is very interesting, and also something I don't really want to touch. Because if there's anything that's going to get people pissy, or YouTube pissy for that matter, it's going to be talking about the history of Yugoslavia. But for purposes of its military equipment, after the Second World War, Yugoslavia was a interesting case in that it received a very large amount of equipment from the United States to try and prevent it from becoming too friendly with the Soviets. Now, it would still ultimately be fairly friendly with the Soviets, although it was a kind of hostile friendliness because Yugoslavia had a pretty significant defense industry and a pretty significant military. But everyone kind of knew that they were building that military against the Soviets, more so against the Western forces. So, again, fascinating, complex, and extremely demonetizing to go into details. Their unique domestic products would start with the OT-M60, which, as with many APCs at the time, was pretty lightly armed and armored, although there would be a pretty common anti-tank upgrade, which was basically strapping two recoilless rifles to the roof. You can actually see both of them on the picture on top, although one of the barrels is fairly obscured. They'd make about 800 of these, starting in 1962, and 200 would later be exported to Iraq, so some export success. However, to put it simply, it was pretty well recognized that they were going to need something a bit better. And that would become the BVP M80, which, yeah, looks an awful lot like a BMP, but with 5 road wheels instead of 6, and maybe a bit more like a squashed nose to it. Production would start in 79, and they'd make about a little over 500 of these. They are still in fairly wide service today, although by the various Yugoslav successor states. You know, after Yugoslavia'd. But the most interesting is the M84, which, yes, it looks an awful lot like a T-72 because it was essentially designed out of export T-72s, and they'd make 650 of these, which, I mean, that's an absolutely respectable tank force. I mean, let me quick check something here. The French currently operate a little over 200 Leclercs, and the Leclerc battle tank has a total production run somewhere around the lines of 900. So, as far as modern militaries go, that's actually a respectable tank production run and a respectable tank fleet. Their production would unfortunately be halted when Yugoslavia stopped existing. And because its production was, due to the nature of Yugoslavia, heavily broken up among its various ethnic groups and subsidiary states at the time, meant that, yeah, when everything broke up, the ability to produce the tank basically stopped. It is still in use by a bunch of the successor states, and is still in use by Kuwait. If you would like to learn more about the story of this particular tank, Tank Encyclopedia actually has a pretty good video covering this, which is actually how I found out about this tank. So I hope this has brought some attention and appreciation for the designs of the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact states. Because with some of the production runs that those vehicles had, it's a little unfair that nobody really knows about them. Before I close out, a little bit of admin for the channel and a sincerely delivered thank you. The response to the M113 video was gratifying and, well, shocking, to put it lightly. As well as the fact that getting a shout out from Battle Order was the cherry on top. Battle Order is a channel I deeply respect and is actually one of the channels that inspired me to start doing that. So there was admittedly a little bit of a fanboy moment when I got that notification while at work. So for all of you that are new to my channel, I hope you stick around. This isn't just a history channel on lesser known and obscure military equipment. Primarily, this is actually meant as a wargaming channel. A wargame that will be getting its first little announcement and showing off 2 weeks from now, assuming everything goes well after quite a few delays in its production, which I apologize for. I hope you'll all stick around to see when that comes out. I would like to wish you all a good day, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.